I begin with talking about my trip here. When I was on the plane, to pass time, they have these word games. And I got involved with it, and there was a Senegalese man next to me. And he got into the game, and we became friends, and he asked, what am I coming to? And in a way, this story says a lot about Souleymane Bachir Diagne's journey. Because when I mentioned the conference and about whom I'm coming to speak, his eyebrows went up, and he said, Bachir? And I bring this up because, you see, although this man left this country 30 years ago to study in U.S. schools, and he works in the United States, it's interesting how Bachir's name moved his heart in connection with his mind. Okay? Now, this is a phenomenon that I'm speaking about that many don't realize happens across this continent. If you're in Ghana and you were to say the name Kwame Gyekye, or you were to say Kwasi Werudu, or if you were to say Benin Pauline Otunji, or if you were to say D.A. Masolo in Kenya, or Adera Oroka, the late Adera Oroka, or if you were to say Mogobe Ramosa in South Africa, Babogomore or Chabani Mangani, a similar response would be made. We're talking here about this unique situation because we could connect it to Nkero Nzegwo in Nigeria or Erenko Oyeyumi. These are individuals who are not simply philosophers, but they're also what it is for philosophy to come out of a country. Okay? Now, the interesting part of the conversation, of course, is he was responding when he said, Bachir. I said, oh yes, we're celebrating Bachir. But then when I mentioned that, Bachir is one of the great philosophers of the continent, he said, ooh. I said, but he's not just of the continent. He's one of the top philosophers in North America. And then he went, ooh. I said, but it's not just North America. He's one of our contemporary great living philosophers globally. And at that moment, he was like, oh my God. Now, we can get into names about greatness, but the history of philosophy with greatness has a double edge to it. On the one hand, even if you're not in philosophy, those who are located at centers of empire often get to represent their communities. And if you look at a lot of the famous philosophers in history, many were achieving fame at the centers of empires. And the United States right now is a hegemon. It's an empire. However, just because you're at the empire doesn't mean you're great. There are many people at the centers of empires who do not speak to the rest of us. So the first thing I'd like to mention is that although Bachir is both here and there, we're celebrating him today because he speaks beyond here and there. He speaks, in a word, across those centers to humanity. Now, when I say this means that, in effect, a great philosopher always speaks to the future. And because of that, brings historical relevance to the present. And through that, gives a new relationship to the past. My relationship with Bachir is now in the beginning of its third decade. I had an unusual situation in my youth, which is I was a young, old man. As a young, old man, I was asked to evaluate many people. including ancestors, believe it or not. I was one of the evaluators for W.B. Du Bois to be placed at the University of Pennsylvania posthumously. But among the people who were older than me, whom I was asked to evaluate, was Bachir when he was being considered at Northwestern. Now, I was already teaching some of his work, but this afforded the opportunity to go through all of his writings up to that time. And let's just say it made me a fan. The complicated thing, of course, is that this strange relationship of evaluating an elder, which is part of what we're doing here, is connected to a value system, a conception of ethical life, in which it is valuable also to become an ancestor. Because in becoming an ancestor, there are descendants. And the many students we've seen here, the legacy, the love, is an expression of a value system in which Bachir's investment in something very crucial is enabling him, as a native son of Senegal, to speak to the world. Now, his deeds that offer him this ability to speak to the world emerges not simply from speaking, because there are a lot of people who could speak and say nothing. It comes from the quality of what he has to say. Okay? And the quality is what enabled him to contribute to a world of thought, to the institutions that protect worlds of thought, and to the pedagogy of other generations. Of course, to do this requires, when I said the future, being nothing short of revolutionary. Now, I know you all are not used to hearing the word revolution mentioned with Bachir. He's a quiet revolutionary. But I'm going to argue he is a revolutionary nevertheless. Okay? To understand this, you need to understand the plight of Bachir and those other intellectuals, those philosophers I mentioned. Okay? Because their plight is unique in that, in addition to building their philosophical work, they had to fight against forms of invisibility. Okay? And in fact, fighting against those forms of invisibility is connected to the very namesake of this institution in which we're meeting. Because look, Sheikh Anta Diop was a revolutionary, not just in political terms, but epistemologically. So it is so fitting that we're honoring this descendant of that intellectual heritage at this institution. So I'm going to mention these forms. I'm going to just mention, there are many invisibilities, but I'm only going to mention 4 because they're relevant to why we're meeting today. And I'll have to go through them quickly for the sake of time. The first is racial invisibility. Now, racial invisibility emerges in a unique way. Because as we know, although there are Africans in the room, your ancestors, our ancestors, were not historically black. Black was an imposition that created the thesis, in a nutshell, that we should not be. It means then, wherever you go, there are always too many black people. It's an obsession across the world today. There's always counting. How many black people are there? How many blacks? Now, I don't have time to get into the details, but the short version is there are always too many blacks. Always. And this creates a form of black melancholia, because it means that the world that created black people said that it's a world that's better off without black people in it. That means to be black is to be indigenous to a world to which you do not belong. So although Bachir was born a man in Senegal, he's an African, he also left Senegal and entered worlds in which he walked into it as a black. And so he fought a struggle against indignities, but he also had the paradox of bringing dignity to that relationship of the black. The second invisibility is about time, because we're here speaking primarily to Africans in Africa. And what Euromodernity placed is the question of your indigeneity, the indigent, the native. This is your native land. Bachir is a native son here. But a peculiar thing happens with colonialism, which is to make the native only belong to the past. It says to be modern, the native must not belong. And so the native, if not belonging to the future, is not legitimate in the present and is devalued with the past. This means then that the struggle, as Sheikh Anta Diop, and I'm going to argue Souleymane Bachir Diagne brought on, is to fight against this notion of indigenous as ghost. If you look not just in Africa, but in North America, in South America, in Australia, indigenous people are always talked about as spiritual. So in effect, the African in Africa is facing being black and indigenous as if you're a ghost. It means the struggle here is to transform, is to understand a future that is yours, which will change your present and make you have a different relationship to your past. The third pertains primarily to women, but colonialism at first lumped black men and women into the same. But historically, before colonialism, it affected women. And that is the invisibility of voice. If you go and read women's writings, women are always articulating the search for a voice. And what colonialism at first did in its effort to erase African thought was the idea that Africans have no voice. This is why also in Haiti, Antoine Firmin, when he went to the French Ethnology Society, he was a member, but he was told he couldn't speak. So his response was to write. And in fact, it's no accident that many of the great writers today are women, because writing is also one of the ways of finding a voice. So Bachir's writings, he speaks. As a man in Senegal, he has a voice orally. But in the fight against the degradation of colonized peoples, he must write. Okay? The last one is epistemological. Okay? In phenomenological language, and we heard about phenomenology earlier, what colonialism did was to say it was illicit, illegal,